Yeah. Good evening and welcome on behalf of Hashtag Generation to this discussion that we're hosting called Politics, Economics, and Dissent. Where do we go from here? Under any other circumstance, as a group that's also doing online campaigns on different issues and so on, hosting a discussion about this kind of topic on the day before Aurudu would be considered, would possibly not be something that we would have done. But these are not ordinary circumstances. And we felt that it is important to have these conversations as we also engage in other events. Someone might ask if having conversations and so on is the priority at this point in time. As hashtag, we had 3 different conversations in Sinhala, English, and Tamil on these issues, simply because we felt it's also important parallel to the action happening offline on the ground and so on, that it's important to raise awareness and also have these conversations as well, and also learn and also talk to each other about these topics, ask questions and so on. Because, for instance, I attended a teaching at Independence Square where there was also discussions about these topics, and things I learned at that event I used at a demonstration sign the next day at a protest. So I think learning, talking, and so on are also possibly a part of the struggle itself, and not necessarily separate from it. And to have this conversation, we have 4 people that have lots of experience and knowledge to share with all of you. And we invited all of these people in the past possibly 48 hours or less than that, and they have all agreed to join us in this discussion. So we really appreciate all of their presence. I will not kind of run through their bios and so on, because a lot of you would already know them, and we also have only allocated 1.5 hours for this whole discussion as well. But in this conversation, we'd like to basically talk about what is happening in Sri Lanka at the moment, but also where we can go from this moment. It's not meant to be prescriptive and tell people, this is the way forward and this is what we need to be demanding, but it's meant to be a conversation for sharing learnings and ideas and experiences and so on. So to open this conversation, we have Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy. She will draw from the experiences the experiences of the protests themselves, and I think speak about some of the demands and the signs and so on that have been used, and how what we can learn from these, but also how we can bring these different demands and groups together. Dr.
Should I speak now? Can you hear me?
Yes, Doctor. Sure, yes.
Well, I'm happy to be here today with you, and thank you for inviting me. This is an extremely important moment in our history. Time is literally standing still with all manner of political possibilities. I think it is also the time to think of new beginnings and imagine new futures while being angry and desperate. I think it's important to protect the moment and keep up the pressure. Today, I thought of presenting a more macro perspective. What we see being created in front of us, like the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and the farmers' protests in India, is a new social movement. Movements are more than their goals. They attempt to mobilize people around shared values and build a sense of community. Some people may say this is only to get rid of the Rajapaksa family, but the teach-outs, the library, the spontaneous talks point to something much larger going on. And in thinking about the politics, the economics, and the dissent, the title of this webinar, I went through all the social media posts, articles in newspapers, and other media outlets to look at what posters people are carrying, what messages people are posting. So, what are the issues of this struggle? What are its constituent elements? So these are not my ideas, though I share most of them, but those emanating from the protesters themselves. And based on these ideas, I have tried to make some suggestions for messaging on specific substantive themes based on my experience. There is no doubt that the first thing that holds these protests together are immediate economic issues: power shortages, no gas, no fuel, no milk powder, no foodstuffs, or foodstuffs at some exorbitant price. There is sheer rage, a mixture of anger and desperation, that we have come to this situation. In handling these economic issues, I feel there are two aspects. There are the technical issues. It is like we have fallen into rapids with water swelling all around. We have to take quick and effective measures to basically stabilize. The economic team that has just taken charge, I think, is competent enough to manage this aspect for the short term. And this is very important, crucial. And I think Dr. Vijay Wardner, I'm sure, will elaborate on this further as he is the leading expert. But there are also political decisions to be made to ensure social protection, the social and economic rights of the people. And this must be an important part of the immediate advocacy, I feel, of civil society groups, even while they are protesting. I think the Feminist Collective has put forward some ideas, and one is to set in place an effective food distribution system with resources collected through diverse sources so that households receive essential items. Existing systems should be strengthened at the local level, not only administrative systems, but also things like cooperatives. It's not that this is a wish list, but what resources are available, the distribution system should get to the people. The need to also have some kind of emergency task force to ensure an effective distribution system for pharmaceuticals and other medical supplies. So I feel this kind of messaging is also important to the crisis what we're going through today. And there must be constant pressure to ensure that whatever IMF program we get into is supplemented by an effective social protection system. The second type of posters and messages being posted contain a searing critique of the political establishment and also the need to reform our political system. Since the drafting of the South African Constitution in the 1990s, and even from earlier, there was a momentum around the world to draft constitutions that maximize democracy, abolish the executive presidency, adoption of some form of proportional representation, establishing the independence of the judiciary and commissions, strengthening the fundamental rights chapter with economic and social rights and gender rights. But during the last decade, scholars have argued that there has been a global conservative backlash against this democratization project and the rise of illiberal democracies, the US under Trump or India or Hungary, with a strong man concept in the time of majority ethno-nationalism. Now, this happened in Sri Lanka in 2019 with the 20th Amendment and the constitution that is currently being drafted by the De Silva Commission. So what have we learned from both these experiences? A strong executive president pursuant to the 20th Amendment is an unmitigated disaster. I think it just has to go. At the same time, a parliamentary democracy with endless crossovers and people being bribed is also a problem. MPs lose all credibility. The recent Minister of Agriculture is one such example. So I think we need to abolish the executive presidency, but also insist on provisions that prevent parliamentary crossover and or the conduct of by-elections if people decide to cross. In this way, we can stop some of the MPs being bought for money. So I was thinking that maybe we should try and advocate, especially with opposition parties, and to try and do this immediately. We also need to strengthen the fundamental rights chapter of our Constitution constitution that has not been amended since 78 and also does not include economic and social rights or gender rights, especially post-pandemic. This is key. The lessons learned over the last few years, the only thing that has saved Sri Lanka somewhat has been FR litigation. It is crucial and actually life-saving in certain circumstances. I think that we have to give a special shout out to young lawyers and their yeoman's work they have been doing in filing cases and representing clients. I think we also, of course, need provisions to strengthen independent commissions. What I'm basically saying is we must reinvigorate the democracy elements of our constitution while understanding the roots of the backlash that took place in 2009 and left us all completely at sea. A third but dominant theme in all these protests and the writings has been the theme of national unity. But again, I remember the terrible campaign of 2019 and a source of insecurity that unethical politicians can tap into. Any movement that does not give Buddhism a special place in the Constitution in this historic era, I think is very unlikely to succeed. I know this is an unpopular thing to say in liberal circles, but I think we have to recognize and accept that. Nevertheless, I hope the moment would open up for a talk about minority issues and the equality of minority groups at the center and power sharing with a negotiated form of devolution at the periphery. This can begin among political parties immediately. Tamil demands have not gone away. Land, disappearances, political prisoners, accountability, militarization, these must all be part of the discussions. And the Muslim sense of insecurity has also to be acknowledged with the blatant discriminatory acts directed against them. In the long term, we should try to create a broad-based social movement for national unity based on a culture of tolerance and mutual respect that we see daily at the Gulf-faced Green. The fourth and very clear message of the protest is the message against corruption and conspicuous consumption by members of the Rajapaksa family and the political and business coterie that surrounds them. It is really for this reason that the present regime may never regain legitimacy, no matter how hard they try. The level of corruption has completely destroyed the moral and social fabric of society. The message against this is clear and sustained in all the messages, all the posters, and aggravated by the deprivations caused by the pandemic and economic collapse. There cannot be any going back on this call for cleaning out the stables. And this call is linked to the fifth message, which is also very clear in these protests, the message for combating impunity. The absolute injustice and unfairness with regard to impunity strikes people to the core. The pardon of people like Sunil Ratnayaka and the dismissal of all corruption and criminal charges against the Rajapaksa family and their friends by the Commission on Political Victimization and the courts make a mockery of our justice system. Stopping impunity must continue to be one of the major aspects of advocacy of any social movement. Hopefully, I think this has already had an immediate deterrent effect. The other and final message in many of these protests, which is not given much publicity, is the public outcry against the alienation of our assets. At the national level, the environmental movement organized a march against the sale of land and destruction of national lands by the government. The way the protesters have conducted this protest makes it very clear they strongly believe in environmental issues. This must be given more publicity. And it's not only the environment, it must be wildlife, like, for example, the protection of elements. There is also strong protest from one section about the alienation of our assets to India, China, and the United States. Reverend Sobitha and his monks made an impassioned plea just yesterday. This aspect of the protest is strongly nationalistic, and one does not know how Reverend Sobitha's JHU will gel with much of the protest movement, which appears to be uniquely multi-religious and multicultural. But the widespread support that these protests have across the country is also due to this aspect, the rejection of the alienation of our assets to foreigners. How will this discussion end? The resolution also determines what kind of economic model we want for Sri Lanka and what will be accepted. This is a strong driver of dissent. Though many are pushing for a national economic policy, the internal contradictions of mindsets and viewpoints may be difficult to negotiate. To conclude, I do not know how all this will play out in the end. Key actors, the protesters, the government, the political parties, where all this dynamic will lead, it's too early to tell. There are immediate constitutional issues that I'm sure Asanga will probably deal effectively with, whether there's resignation, no confidence motions, impeachment, whether things will end smoothly. But as I said, what has been created is a social movement. In many ways, it is the coming of age and the first social expression of the post-war generation. Young people are its energy and dynamism. The decentralization and spontaneity is unique to this generation. It is a healthy, inclusive, nonviolent social movement standing up against the cynicism and the deal-making that couches everyday life in Sri Lanka. I wish you strength. Enjoy the moment, but be firm. This is the stuff of history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kumaraswamy. I think it's a really great opening for our discussion as well, of a summary of the different demands that are being made, where these demands can unite, but also in some ways where there may be tensions as well. I think it's a great opening for the discussion, and as you said, some of the immediate drivers for this movement have been economic. So on that note, I think we can go to our second panelist, Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, and he will speak more on the next steps and the way forward in terms of the economy and so on. Dr. Wijewardena.
Thank you very much, Senel, and I think the Radhika had actually provided the necessary background for us to continue this discussion. If you look at Sri Lanka's economy today, the economic situation is no secret to anyone of us. The country has been bankrupt, and as a result, the Sri Lanka's central bank and the Ministry of Finance together have decided to suspend the repayment of all the foreign debt that are to fall after 5 p.m. on the 12th of April 2022, which cover almost all types of external debt which the government of Sri Lanka has taken, plus any foreign debt which any of the governmental entities has obtained with the guarantee from the government. So therefore, it's a very wide coverage, which means that the Sri Lanka cannot repay any of the foreign debt that it has. If we, because the total foreign debt that is to mature within the next 12-month period belonging to the central government is about $7 billion US, and we don't have that much of foreign exchange with us. Our foreign exchange reserves have nearly fallen to a zero level when it comes to the usable foreign exchange reserves. So therefore, in my view, these are not an action taken by the government of Sri Lanka on its own, but it's an action to which the government of Sri Lanka has been forced by the circumstances. So along with the suspension of the repayment of foreign debt, the government has announced that it would go for a restructuring of foreign debt belonging to the government of Sri Lanka. Plus, it will seek financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund in order to overcome the current acute balance of payments crisis. Now, these are very important measures which the government of Sri Lanka would be taking. Now, if we plan to go from here to forward, we'll have to keep in our mind seeking funds from the International Monetary Fund, as well as restructuring the existing foreign debt will not solve our problems. That is because there's a fundamental difference between the financial sector and the real sector of the economy. The financial sector is simply an imagination in our mind. It doesn't actually has a real existence. It is the real sector which should actually provide benefits and the welfare for us. For example, We cannot eat a 5,000 rupee note, but we can eat the rice that we can buy by using the 5,000 rupee note. So in the past, Sri Lanka has gone to the International Monetary Fund on 16 occasions. On 9 occasions, Sri Lanka has completed the program, and 6 occasions, Sri Lanka has defaulted its program or completed it halfway through. And therefore, many people are questioning the validity of Sri Lanka going to IMF today. That is because there is a misunderstanding about what the IMF program can do and what Sri Lanka should do in order to gain the permanent improvement in the welfare of the people. That is because, as I have mentioned, the IMF would provide funding to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to overcome the acute shortage of foreign exchange within the banking system. It's a financial sector resolution. And the financial sector in any country is only a facilitator for the development of the real sector. It is the real sector which we'll have to target for. In the past, what happened was all the governments which had sought the IMF support had stopped at getting funds from the IMF and overcoming the balance of payments problem at that particular point of time. And also, the government had been to overcome, but they had ignored the fact that Sri Lanka will have to go for this real sector reform in order to develop the country. So I will concentrate on the real sector reform that are needed. And the most important factor is the creation of a ground situation that would be conducive for economic development to happen, and at the same time, for us to have a sustainable economic development. That is where Radhika's presentation about the good governance, rule of law, and the institutional setup that we have to establish in Sri Lanka are very important for us. Now, when it comes to the institutional setup, many people think that institutions are simply the organizations, but in economics, institutions are simply values and ethos of a society. And we must have the conducive ethos, conducive values, and conducive moral behavior for all Sri Lankans to behave. And why Sri Lanka has remained a developing country throughout this period, irrespective of the massive investments the government and all other individuals have made during that period, mainly because Sri Lanka has not done anything to improve the institutional setup. So what it means is that the value system in Sri Lanka will have to change, and that value system will be a corruption-free society where the rule of law will be observed, everybody will be under the same law, and at the same time, the law and order should be maintained without fear or favor, and the judiciary should be independent, and most important factor is the people whom we elect to parliament should be of absolutely high, unquestionable moral character. Now, that is the institutional setup that we have to set up in Sri Lanka. After we have this ground situation cleared, what is necessary for Sri Lanka to do is to have a proper plan to take Sri Lanka forward. And that particular plan should necessarily be one which involves the introduction of high technology to Sri Lanka's production system and thereby improve the productivity in Sri Lanka. And that is not a function of IMF, nor is it a function of the central bank. It is the function of the government of Sri Lanka. And that is where all the previous IMF programs had not been able to deliver sustainable economic growth to Sri Lanka because the government had failed to provide this type of plan to take us forward. Now, if you look at the present production system in Sri Lanka, we are actually in the second industrial revolution. In the second industrial revolution, what happened was the mechanization was done by electric things, and but the world had moved, say, in 1970s and 80s to electronic ones, which is a major component of the third industrial revolution. But the world has now moved to the fourth industrial revolution, which has actually moved on from the third industrial revolution and consolidate its production system. So Sri Lanka will have to move from from second industrial revolution to the fourth industrial revolution, bypassing the third industrial revolution. This is difficult, but not impossible. In fact, Vietnam, one of the Eastern Asian countries, it has actually prepared a roadmap in year 2019 to take Vietnam to the fourth industrial revolution by year 2030. So it's not a short-term measure, it's a long-term measure. So what the government of Sri Lanka should do from here, whoever would be the ruler of the country, it has to come up with a roadmap that to take Sri Lanka from the present second industrial revolution to the fourth industrial revolution and connect us seamlessly to the global trade. And that is how we would be able to create wealth, and that is how we will be able to provide welfare to Sri Lankan citizens. That is how we will be able to attain a sustainable economic growth so that Sri Lanka can become a developed country within a single generation, just like the countries like Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong did in 1970s and 80s. For that purpose, there must be a massive change in the thinking pattern of our people. For that, and that can be done by introducing and also completely rehauling the educational structure. Now, many people are arguing that Sri Lanka should go for SMET, science, mathematics, engineering, and technology. But I would add another element to this. I will add the creative art to that. Therefore, in my view, it should not be SMET, but it's MEET, science, mathematics, engineering, creative art, and technology. And that should be the part and parcel of the Sri Lanka's education. Now, this is a very important thing because many have the feeling that art is not a subject that would contribute to economic development. Contrary to that, art will contribute to the economic development mainly because it will create creative people. And creativity is the most important requirement for Sri Lanka today. And as a result, education should be completely overhauled by introducing all these 5 elements to education. Then Sri Lanka should have a roadmap to take it from the second industrial revolution to the fourth industrial revolution, and by introducing technology and improving productivity. But all these things to work at the ground level, the most important requirement is, as Radhika had mentioned, we need good governance, we need a corruption-free society, we need a good institutional setup, we need a change in the values and the ethos of Sri Lankans today. So that is the basic thing that we have to do, and that is how we should move from the here to the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayawardena, for that intervention where, of course, you spoke about the economic side of things, but you also brought in how it's linked to governance as well, and politics and governance and constitutional reform. So that brings us to our next panelist, because many of the demands that are being made are also linked to the constitution, constitutional reform, and so on. So we have Dr. Asanga Valikala joining us to speak about the constitution, constitutional reform, and the way forward. Dr. Valikala.
Thank you, Sanil. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I will proceed then. Thanks very much to you as well as #Generation for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I would like to also associate myself fairly broadly with the way that Radhika framed our discussion at the very beginning. I think that was a very useful way of analyzing and understanding the various sort of public demands that are coming out of this unprecedented protest movement that we are currently having in our country. I may not agree with every detail and in every sense with the way that Radhika read it, but very broadly, I would definitely say that would be the way to understand and extrapolate from these disparate voices from the protests what it is that people who are protesting in our country are asking for. And particularly, I would like to stress the points that she made about the institutional dimension of the discontent, that the constitution has to change, the system of governance has to change. There has to be a greater attention to the socio-economic well-being of our people, and to the extent that the constitution has a role to play in that, then the constitution must be reformed to do that. That there's a great desire for politics and governance to deliver for the people in terms of the economic governance, and not for the benefit of a cabal and a dynasty in power and its hangers-on. So that's the sort of broad perspective from which I would also more specifically discuss things that we need to do on the constitutional reform front. One caveat before I go further is to say that there are many more things to be done. We probably need a new constitution, but those are for later, once we have stabilized the economy and our people are no longer suffering with shortages and power cuts and cost of living crisis. We need to get back to a constitutional conversation around many other things, but that is a different conversation. But I would start by stressing that this economic crisis today has a very strong constitutional and governance dimension. So the solution in terms of getting out of this is very much also an institutional and constitutional question. Some have heard the argument made, why are we talking about doing constitutional reforms and all this messy stuff around which we have very little consensus around? Why are we talking about all of that when all the attention of our society and our politicians ought to be on dealing with economic questions? I agree with that, but the question is not either or. There is a constitutional and governing dimension to this that we must admit to deal with very much as a part of a durable, effective solution to get out of the current pass. And remember also, of course, that when the current president was campaigning for the office in 2019, he, his party, and those other networks around him, like the Viatmaga group, for example, also made this. At that point, he was being promoted as a technocratic candidate from outside politics who is going to come and shake things up, very much a kind of efficient authoritarian model. And they very clearly stated that there was a constitutional dimension, that's why they passed the 20th Amendment, centralizing power in the executive presidency when they were elected. So they passed that, and that model has obviously failed spectacularly. We haven't got to this kind of situation, even allowing for the pandemic. The pandemic is something that entire world, but very few countries have gone under in the way that we have, and that is partly because of the constitutional model that we have of political decision making. The executive, the problem with the executive presidency is that it over-centralizes political power in one person, and the effect of over-centralization is the undermining necessarily of checks and balances. Parliament becomes devalued, the court become less important in the constitutional system, the separation of powers is affected, and that is not a good, neither a democratic nor efficient way of making decisions. When one person has much more greater scope to make mistakes, to be poor at the job, and when the whole system is geared towards this office and all powers are concentrated around it, then what happens is that when that person fails, the whole system fails. So that is the central argument which we are seeing articulated in the protests, that it is not simply a matter of Gota and the Rajapaksas go home and all their Karapnis go home, but there is also this great dimension of that as an understanding in our very fast maturing electorate, that the system that we have has to change. And that is why I would say that a very clear dimension of this has to be the abolition of the executive presidential system and its replacement with a model that better protects the separation of powers and checks and balances, such that we have not only a more democratic system of government, but one that works efficiently and delivers what it's supposed to deliver on, which is good government. Good government also does not mean just protecting rights and democracy, although those are very important. But remember that good government also means efficient and delivering government, such that we don't end up in economic catastrophes like this, because power is centralized around one person, and power is exercised for the benefit of a very small group of people around him. That is why we are where we are. So it is very, very important to stress at the very beginning that the abolition of the executive presidential system is an absolutely essential condition of our recovery from this economic disaster that we are currently in. Now, as I said earlier, there are many other things to talk about constitutional reform in general in Sri Lanka, but I'm focusing here today on what needs to be done in the coming days and weeks, because we need to get this over very fast and very quickly, efficiently, although transparently, so that the parliament, the newer government, and everybody else can start concentrating on the policy dimensions, the very, very difficult economic decisions that we will have to be making, and as Dr. Vijayawardena has so clearly outlined for us. So there are two elements to the constitutional questions that we have to deal with in the next hours, days, weeks. The first is the resignation of the president and the resignation of the prime minister and the other cabinet ministers to be replaced with a new government. Why am I stressing resignation? Because that is the most effective and quick way of securing the vacation from office of people who have lost the legitimacy to govern. If they do not do this, there are other methods that are available, including things that I talked about, no confidence vote in parliament that can take out the prime minister, impeachment process. But these should be, the no confidence motion certainly should be something that parliament uses strategically to pressure the government to resign. But the impeachment is something that probably has to be taken as a last resort option, because it's a very difficult and very complicated and very time-consuming process. Time is not something that we have in the current economic circumstances to be focusing on a very serious constitutional process like impeachment, which goes on for weeks, if not months. So the ideal scenario is that we should get the political pressure sufficiently up to ensure that these people will resign. That is not impossible, but that's a political question. It is for the opposition in particular and all other parties, and probably people within even the SLPP governing party who have now changed their minds about the Rajapaksas to ensure this. I'm not a politician, and I'm not the closest political follower of parliamentary politics in Sri Lanka. So I leave that entirely in the hands of the people who are there in parliament, and particularly the opposition. If they're going to behave in a principled manner, the numbers that they have to get, the 113 for no confidence votes, an alternative for a no confidence vote, the 113 that is needed for an alternative government, and for constitutional amendment, the 2/3 that are necessary. This is necessarily a messy and difficult and complicated political task, but they have to do it, and there is no question about that. So that responsibility is squarely theirs. I am going to tell them to discuss here what we need to do. So resignation is the first thing that we have to ensure, and we must do this very quickly because the government has to be replaced and be in situ to deal with the IMF particularly. So the next constitutional amendment will be the 21st constitutional amendment to the Constitution. And a number of things that must be said, as I mentioned already. So the two main substantive elements of the next constitutional amendment bill has to do two things. One is abolish the executive presidential system, and we return power to a parliamentary executive, and I will explain that a little bit more in some detail. The second thing is the restoration or the re-establishment of the Constitutional Council, which is the sort of multi-party body that we had, which recommends appointments to the independent commissions, which depoliticizes government and acts as also another check on and balance on the elected political executive, and also approves, the Constitutional Council approves nominations by the president for appointments to key state officers like the IGP, the Attorney General, and so on and so forth. We are very familiar with this framework because that is what we have had previously under the 17th Amendment, under the 19th Amendment. These were all diluted, if not completely gutted by the 20th Amendment. They have to be re-established. They are important. They're an important institutional safeguard for good governance in our country. And we can add a few more to that. For example, we already know that when we restore the kind of 19th Amendment framework in this respect, that we will have the Human Rights Commission, the Public Service Commission, Judicial, all those commissions that were made independent, to which we can probably add the Right to Information Commission now, as well as perhaps the Port City Commission. And in addition to the officers like the IGP and the Attorney General, which we bring in within that framework, we should probably also add the central bank governor to ensure the independence of the governor of the central bank. So next, I would like to say a little bit about what I mean by the abolition of the executive presidency. Let's start with the limitations that we are working with. If we are to do this expeditiously, even though transparently, but quite quickly, because we need to get this out of the way fast in order for us to start focusing on the economic response to the crisis. So what I mean here is that the president will remain the head of state and the commander-in-chief and all of those names, titles and designations that come with the office of head of state. But the president, he or she, will become a kind of more of a symbol of national unity rather than an active player in the executive. We can also give the president certain other roles, and I will mention that in a moment. But effectively, what this means is that the president will generally act on the advice of the prime minister, who will convey to him the advice of the cabinet collectively, right? And the prime minister and the cabinet are the people who enjoy the confidence of parliament. In the appointment and dismissal of the prime minister and the cabinet, it is the confidence of parliament that matters, not what the president thinks is appropriate or not. And the third element of abolition, so the president acting on the advice of the prime minister. So that way, what happens is, even though the law may mention the president shall do this or the president may do that, in effect, what this clause would do is to ensure that when the president acts, unless where the law clearly states that he must act in his own personal discretion, all his official actions are taken on the advice of the cabinet through the prime minister. That is the effect of abolition, and that is what we must do. And then the prime minister and the cabinet are accountable, responsible to parliament, and must enjoy the confidence of parliament to survive in office. The third element of abolition is the mode of election of the president. It is the direct election of the president that gives him a lot of power, give him or her a lot of power. And in the past, we have seen executive presidents even exceeding the legal powers that they have, because they are the one person in the system who can claim a kind of democratic mandate from the whole country. Now that must be taken away, and it is not inappropriate. It is not appropriate for a titular president to be elected by direct. That we don't need neither the expense of a direct election to president. So the election of the president is something that goes again to parliament. So the president will become electable by parliament. So those are the three things. When we use the shorthand abolition of the executive presidency, that is what we mean. Now, some people would say that these are some things. This is something that is such a big change to the structure of the 1978 Constitution that we may require a referendum in addition to a two-thirds majority in Parliament. And I must say that until quite recently, I too generally took this view. Even though the law is debatable, I also thought that it might be appropriate when we are doing this to have a referendum so that the people have a say. But the circumstances now are different, and I have changed my mind on the interpretation of the law. I have reread the Supreme Court determinations on previous constitutional amendments that where the Supreme Court has said these are doable. These kinds of changes to the executive presidency are doable with a two-thirds only. There are things that the Supreme Court has mentioned will require certainly a referendum in addition to a two-thirds. And having looked at that, and I'm persuaded by the arguments made by my colleagues in Sri Lankan constitutional law, very eminent and very respected voices such as Dr. Jayanpathy Wickramaratne PC, Dr. Dinesha Samararatna of the Colombo Law Faculty, Mr. Suren Fernando, a practitioner at the bar, has also made this case. So I am persuaded that a carefully crafted constitutional amendment, which has the effect of abolition in the way that I have just defined it, can be done without the need for a referendum. Or at the very least, a very strong and persuasive case can be made to the Supreme Court that we can do these changes without a referendum. And I'm persuaded with that, and I will argue that, make that case very, very strongly indeed. So again, as I said, the reason why we want to avoid referendums at this stage is not because we want to avoid giving the people a chance to have a say in what the constitutional changes are, simply because of the fact that we are in the middle of an economic crisis that requires very, very quick attention. We have not even still begun the process almost of dealing with the thing, and we have with the economic crisis, we'll have a very long road ahead, a very high mountain to climb. So we must start giving our attention to all of that. So this must be done quite quickly. Having a referendum is something that takes a lot of time. Not only that, but a referendum is a very costly thing to do. There are different estimates of what a referendum costs. It could be 8 billion rupees. And this is not money that we have right now. And it is not, but we just don't have the time to engage in referendum campaigns and do all of that. If you have to do a referendum well, there has to be proper campaigns where two sides or even more sides of the argument are properly aired for the public to be able to exercise their constitutional choice in an informed way. We won't be able to do that kind of referendum in the situation that we are in. So that is the reason why we will take deeper decisions with regard to our constitution at a later stage when the economic situation has stabilized somewhat. For this, so we need to do, as part of the economic recovery, we need to do certain institutional changes to our political executive. And that is why we are trying to do these things, which have to be done without the need for a referendum. And that I argue is necessary. Now, there may be other actors in the political world who may say, no, why we do that? We may be able to have a referendum. That is a political call. But my reading of the situation is that a referendum, it is desirable that a referendum is avoided at this stage. There are two other points that I will end up with, and that is the role of the president after abolition. Now, I had already mentioned that he or she will remain the head of state and commander-in-chief and all of that kind of stuff, the head of state. It seems clear from the Supreme Court determinations on this question before that the Supreme Court has held that the president also must remain a part of the cabinet. That also we will have to maintain. Unless we want to change that, then we will need a referendum. So the president will have that role in being involved in the decision-making processes at the top of the political executive. And we can give the president certain other roles as well. Now, for example, I would really like if the president did have the role in chairing something like a National Security Council, something like a National Economic Council. Now, this is not to undermine or to create a parallel structure that rivals the cabinet and the prime minister, but more of a discussion forum such that within the executive itself, there are other views aired. The president can invite independent experts living in Sri Lanka and abroad, Sri Lankans as well as others, to come and discuss these matters, right, at the height, at the absolute apex of the government. And these are all roles that we can ensure that the president has. The president would also, in this kind of system, consistent with other Commonwealth experiences, have the right to be informed, have the right to give advice, non-binding advice to the prime minister, to advise and to warn. These are all roles that the president of the republic will continue to have. So this is not some sort of completely useless symbolic figure who's going to be paid a salary to do nothing. We expect that person to have a very senior, mature role in the smooth functioning of the executive in a very constructive way. And of course, the person that we choose for that role will also be very, very important, and not the kind of people that we've had in that office recently. They will have to be respected people who can appeal to all Sri Lankans across our diversity, and have the standing to embody the republic in that office. So that's the kind of role that the president will have. But the executive government will, for all intents and purposes, be run by the prime minister and the ministers of the cabinet, of which I would argue there should be no more than about 25 in the cabinet and about 35, 40 other junior ministers. That is more than enough. Much larger, much more populous countries do with that size of cabinet. There's no reason a small country, which furthermore can't afford the expense of all of this, should have these massive cabinets, jumbo cabinets that we have had in the past. So the limitation, a cap on membership, is also another aspect of the 21st Amendment, of a potential 21st Amendment bill. Now, the final point I would make is the point about, and Radhika also sort of, I think, mentioned this at the beginning, was about defections. A lot of people are very, very concerned that when you make the political executive dependent on the confidence of parliament, that means usually a majority in parliament, you can change those majority by corrupt means. And of course, our experience is not very good in these matters. You can basically purchase members of parliament through bribery and corruption to cross over, which means the governments will be very, very precarious. And that is not a good argument. That is not a good situation the argument goes, especially when the government that will have to take over after the Rajapaksas have been compelled, hopefully peacefully, to leave office in the next few days. Will have to take extraordinarily difficult economic decisions. That's going to really, be very painful for society to handle. So the government must have stability. I agree. And a lot of people would say it's also not possible with the present proportional representation system that we have. I agree. Electoral reform, there is a dimension of the election system in the way that the representation in parliament is produced, and that can have an effect on the relative stability or weakness of the executive from the design perspective. But nevertheless, for our situation, once again, let me stick to the concrete stuff that we have to do right now. We are not going to have agreement on electoral reform and changing. It's again not appropriate to do electoral reform in such a quick way. There is a lot of disagreement on that among political parties, among minority parties, for example, and all of that. So that is a question for a longer constitutional conversation. But in order to ensure the stability of a parliamentary executive that the 21st Amendment bill will establish, a parliamentary executive, we can do. We can ensure how we do votes of no confidence. We can establish super majorities for votes of no confidence. To bring down the government, you will need a little bit more than a simple majority. Super majorities for votes of confidence, that's one. We can exempt, for example, budgets from being treated as confidence votes in the government for an interim, for a short period, for a time-limited period, in order to ensure the stability of. We can also do anti-defection provisions. Anti-defection provisions are very successfully done in India, where this was an endemic problem in the 1970s, and the Indians made a constitutional amendment and dealt with it fairly effectively. In our case, there are two things that we need to do. We do not need to ban crossovers. I think that's a bad idea. There is an important principle called the freedom of conscience of members of parliament. Even though in our experience, crossovers happen for very corrupt and undesirable purposes, the principle itself is an important one, which is to say that a member of parliament must be not only just an ambassador of the electorate that has elected him, but also somebody capable of exercising their own judgment. And if their conscience prevents them from going with their party, for example, and that may include crossing from one party to another, in principle, that must be allowed. But what we must be guarding against is the mischief to which that principle is often put and has been put in our experience. And there are two things that need to be done in order to deal with this effectively. One is, when members of parliament cross over to the government, there has to be a comprehensive constitutional prohibition on MPs crossing over and accepting ministerial office and all the perks and salaries and patronage that goes with that, or any other kind of remunerated position in the government. They can cross, but they must remain backbench MPs supporting the governing party, nothing more for the remainder of that parliament. Once there's a new election, if they are elected from their new party, from the governing party, and they come back, then they can accept ministerial office in the next parliament. That's okay. The second thing is, I think we can introduce the requirement of by-elections. So anybody who crosses over has to subject themselves to a by-election in the electorate. Now, people would argue we have a proportional representation system, which is district-based, not a first-past-the-post system, which is constituency-based. So how can we have by-elections? No, we can have by-elections for this very specific purpose and specific purpose only. If you cross, you need to go back to the people who elected you and asked and basically the election has the effect of giving the voters a chance to have a say about what they think about what their MP has done. And that exemption to PR can be introduced for this specific purpose without any difficulty, in my view. So those are some of the things that we essentially need. But I also take Radhika's point about this very great desire that is being expressed in protests like at the Wall Face and elsewhere on social media and so on, about the need for a greater protection of rights that go to the socio-economic well-being of the people. Now, there are very many ways of doing that, but we do know from the evidence that we have that the inclusion of socio-economic rights into our fundamental rights chapter has been a desire among our people for a very long time, and there's a fairly high degree of support for that. Now, some of you will know that at one point I was an opponent of constitutionalizing justiciable socioeconomic rights, but after a very great consideration of the matter, I have changed my mind. I have in fact joined my other colleagues like Gehan Gunatilaka, Kumarawadivel Guruparan, Kalna Senaratna, Dinesha Samaratna, in proposing, in fact, a full bill of fundamental rights, a draft fundamental rights chapter, which includes socioeconomic rights for our situation, which we submitted to the both to the newspapers and published, as well as submitted it to the Ramesh De Silva committee, which was supposed to be considering a new constitution. We don't know whether how they took it on board or not, but we are certainly on public record offering a new Bill of Rights that has the potential to deal with some of these demands that seem to be coming out of the current public protests. And those are matters, though, again, I would generally argue that those are things that is better if we have a very long, much more longer term constitutional conversation about. Once the economy established, there's been a realized and there's been a new round of election, a fresh parliament and a new government formed in about 2 to 3 years. And at that point of time, probably we can take those things up. But if there is a political consensus among the parties in parliament who will provide the 2/3 for the 21st constitutional amendment, that some of these things also can be done, then of course there is no problem with that. And certainly from a technical point of view, the ideas, proposals, and options for this kind of thing already exist from which we can draw. So I would just stop myself at that. Thank you very much, Senel, for giving me the time.
Thank you, Dr. Valikala, for sharing those ideas, but also to laying down specific next steps as well and proposals. And Dr. Valikala also spoke about human rights. So on that note, I think we can go to Dr. Pakiswati Saravanamuthu. Dr. Sara will speak about human rights and human rights in the sense of one, I think, of the protesters themselves, but also some of the human rights demands that are being made as well as part of this struggle. Dr. Sara.
Thank you, Sanal. First of all, let me place on record my appreciation and admiration for the Go Tha Go Home protesters and my support and solidarity with them. Now, I think a lot has been said so far by the previous 3 speakers, and by and large, I agree and endorse and support all of it. Would you want me to talk in terms of the human rights situation as far as protesters are concerned? And also you have mentioned that I should talk about some minority rights as well. Well, I mean, I think, in this situation of political instability, I don't think we are going to get any progress as far as the resolution of the national question is concerned. And while some may consider it a propitious time to front load the reform agenda, that too is probably not going to happen. But be that as it may, I think we are talking here about the full implementation of the 13th Amendment and going beyond it in terms of the national question. Cutting defense spending and reallocating it, since we are supposed to be in peacetime, and the defense spending is the largest proportion of the budget. And do we know that the largest concentration of the armed forces is in the north and east? Something that has come up before the Gotha Go Home campaign went into full steam was the whole question of the repeal and replacement of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. I think that is something that must be done, because it's not only a question of minority rights, it's a question of all human rights in this country. And it has been used against journalists, it has been used against members of the majority community. And we really need to make sure that we're not tinkering, as the government did with the amendments that came up and which we challenged in court, but we need to actually repeal it and replace it with legislation which is fully consonant with international human rights standards. Now, in addition to all of that, I think the question that really does arise is in terms of, are we going to take on and take into account, once again, Resolution 30/1 that was passed at the Geneva Human Rights Council, which contains, I think, most of the actions that the government needs to take, and indeed that the Yaha government agreed to, from the reconciliation mechanisms to the emblematic cases, to all of that. And I think, yes, this is something that a new government should definitely revisit and take it onto its agenda. But as I said earlier, I don't think any of these things are going to happen immediately, because, as other speakers have also pointed out, the question of what happens immediately is the resolution of the current political standoff. And that's a resolution which is also going to affect the IMF negotiations and the talk about stable government. On the one hand, you have the protesters who say that Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the rest of his family must go. They also must be held accountable for the money that they have looted and plundered. On the other side, you have Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who will not go. Basically because, as far as he sees it, he can't go. If he does go, he will lose whatever protection, whatever impunity he has for all the things that he has done in the past, and also that his family too will lose whatever protection, etc., that they have, that it will be kind of match over. So there has got to come to a point at which some sort of political compromise has got to be made, or else, if the pressure does not intensify out in the streets to get Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the Rajapaksas out, then we will have to come to that compromise. Because if we do not, and the stalemate continues, it is entirely possible, and there are suggestions that the government may have started doing it, that violent and mischievous elements may be infiltrated into the protest movement, or, well, basically into the protest movement to create a law and order situation, which then brings up the whole specter of who is going to resolve that law and order situation. Does it bring the armed forces into a much bigger role on the grounds that only they can resolve it? And you can go into 101 possible or alternative options with regard to a worst possible case scenario. Of course, my personal preference is that the protests do intensify and the president is persuaded, is convinced that he must resign. There is the other dimension, of course. Will he resign without trying to strike a deal about prosecution for all the alleged crimes that he has committed? And this is one question that the protesters will also have to consider. If they agree that, yes, okay, they will intensify their protest to the point of making him resign, will they therefore agree that, yes, either he gets a promise, a guarantee that prosecutions will not be served against him and his family, or that they won't be done immediately, that there will be some kind of grace period or whatever, but effectively that it will be a compromise. Now, I have talked here in terms of the personalities, in terms of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the Rajapaksa family and all of that. But of course, I agree wholeheartedly. It is a systemic problem. And indeed, I'm sure Mr. Vijayawardena will agree, it has been a systemic problem that is large part of the economic dimension of what is essentially a governance problem, that we have lived well beyond our means. And we have spent far more than we have earned. But it is also a political problem insofar as we have treated the electorate not as citizens, but rather as voters. So we need to come to accept that beyond the immediate problem of getting rid of the Rajapaksas, that we have this proper institutional reform, because that is the only salvage, if you like, and the only sword or shield that we have against this thing occurring into the future. So we have to abolish the executive presidency. We have to get probably a mixed member proportional representation system as far as electoral system is concerned. We have to get independent state institutions. Start with those three may very well be on the road to better recovery. One last thing, and that is with regard to the politics of what is going to happen immediately. Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa wants to stay as president, but he seems to be keen on having some sort of all-party government. The opposition is adamant about joining it because it doesn't want to take responsibility for whatever pain and bitter medicine will have to be endured as a consequence of an IMF agreement. Well, we are suffering considerable pain at the present moment, but it might, as I've said always, it probably get worse before it gets better. So what we badly need is a communication strategy of why we will have to do these rather uncomfortable things to get ourselves out of this mess. And as we all know, the communication strategy needs credible and effective communicators to the mass of the people in a language that is accessible to them, in a language that they will understand. If we can do that, we can not only begin to change the institutions, but I think we can also begin to change the culture that animates all the good constitutions and all the good legislation that we have, that actually violates it in practice, because the culture is not there. So we have to have an effective communication strategy, and perhaps this is also where the people protesting, the Go Home protesters, also have to consider as to whether they are going to continue to be a kind of political movement, a force for good governance in this country, which will tell the truth to their fellow citizens and convince their fellow citizens that if we are to get out of the mess that we are in, it has to get worse before it gets better, but get better it will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sarah, for that. And thank you for outlining the issue, but also posing things that can be a way forward as well in terms of the communications and so on. And Dr. Sarah ended on this note as well, that despite all of these issues that people have been facing, especially in terms of the economic struggles and so on, there is light. I've been at the protest locations, and especially at Gulf-Face, which is now Gotago Gama, and I think that name will stick. And there's so much energy. The energy in these places are electric, and the kinds of messages, kinds of things that we are seeing as well are maybe things that I personally didn't think were even kind of imaginable in this context. Even a few weeks ago, there are images of killed and disappeared journalists on the walls of the presidential secretariat, and as far as I'm concerned, I couldn't have seen that kind of thing happen in this context we're in now, even just a week ago. So there is also, like Dr. Sarah said, some light as well. I think on that note, we can go to the questions. We have a whole bunch of questions that have come in, so I'm trying to kind of combine similar questions and ask them together. So we have a question from I think this is for Dr. Vijayawardena from both Mudita as well as Leonie. They're both asking about, basically Leonie is asking how we can generate more foreign revenue through exports, and Mudita is also asking along the same lines about how we can generate more revenue, and basically what the government needs to do to go towards the fourth industrial revolution that Dr. Vijayawardena spoke about, especially because kind of educational reforms and so on will be more long-term, but what needs to be done right now is the question. Dr. Vijayawardena, if you can take that one up.
Yes, thank you, Senel. I think it's a very good question, because we'll have to understand the fact that, about, say, 50 years ago, to earn foreign exchange, we were simply exporting visible commodities like tea, rubber, and coconut, and so forth. But in today's context, we don't talk anymore about the export of goods. We are actually talking about the exports of goods and services. Now, Sri Lanka has actually come to its own limit with respect to the export of goods, because number one is we don't have raw materials. Number two, most of the industries that we have chosen, like apparel, are now shifting away from Sri Lanka, and also they are being now insured in the countries where they are sold. So as a result, there is a necessity for us to go for a new line of technology-based commodities. But without any problem, Sri Lanka can improve its ICT exports, like as the way India has done. Now remember, in South India, when Sri Lanka opened its economy in 1977, we were the first to introduce ICT to any country in South South Asia. India was far behind us. But India has caught up with us now, and they are moving ahead with us, like countries like Israel and Ireland. And therefore, they have become one of the leading exporters of the ICT services. Now, what Sri Lanka can do is, if Sri Lanka cannot penetrate the market immediately, Sri Lanka can actually team up with Indian teams, so that we would be providing a part of the services via India. And apart from the ICT services, there are other services that we can provide to the rest of the world: education, healthcare services, shipping services, airline services. And all these are actually earners of foreign exchange today. Now, for a country which does not have any valuable material, raw materials, except the human brain that we have, there is no any choice other than going for the export of services. And for that purpose, our university system will have to be geared to research and technology. And we have, first-class research institutions like the Industrial Technology Institute, ITI, Tea Research Institute, then the Rubber Research Institute, Coconut Research Institute, and all these institutes are staffed with the best brains in Sri Lanka. And what we can do is, in the roadmap talking about, we'll have to assign specific duties and commitments to these research institutes and universities to come up with new technology that would be adopted by Sri Lankan businessmen and take us to the rest of the world. So this is the major responsibility of the government. It's not the responsibility of the IMF, nor is it the responsibility of the central bank. It is the responsibility of the government, because it is the government which has the resources to do this. So I hope that even the present government or the new government that is to come to power will take these factors seriously into consideration and prepare a roadmap to convert us from, say, the second industrial revolution, which is based on the electric type of machinery, to the fourth industrial revolution, which is based on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and Internet of Things, and also blockchain technology and all kinds of algorithms that we use in the production process. All these things have to be introduced to Sri Lanka as a priority, bypassing the third industrial revolution. That's why I said it is difficult but not impossible if we have a roadmap like Vietnam, which would take Sri Lanka to this ultimate goal by year 2035. That is my timeline for converting Sri Lanka to fourth industrial revolution. For that purpose, we have universities in Sri Lanka which actually do research, applied research. We have research institutions in Sri Lanka, and all these the resources in all these institutions will have to be mobilized by us to reach this particular goal. That is how we would be able to increase the foreign exchange revenue in the medium to long term. Immediately, we cannot do it because we are actually saddled with a production system which is inefficient, which is low productivity, and also which does not, which is not flexible to the market changes. So as a result, immediately we cannot gain anything, but in the long run, medium to long run, we can attain all these goals.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayawardena, for that. I will immediately go to the next question so that we can take as many as we can within the time. We have 4 questions from Dinidu Diavis. I'll take 2 together for now. One, I think this is for Dr. Valikula, but also anyone in the panel. If I'm taking 2 out of the 4, if the current ticks any of the boxes that are needed to be ticked for impeachment with either apparent or clear evidence. So they were asking if the current president ticks any of the boxes with apparent or clear evidence that are needed to be ticked. Then another question is asking if there is anything that's stopping the president from stubbornly, repeatedly reappointing the same cabinet after successful no confidence motions. So if the president can stubbornly reappoint the cabinet after successful no motions. Anyone respond to that?
I think Asanga can answer it because he's the constitutional lawyer here.
Yeah, Dr. Valikula.
Well, so is Radhika, but I'll give Senel, the way that you summarized wasn't very clear to me. I'm really very sorry. So I'm going to sort of I think I got the sort of gist of what you were sort of selecting. But there were 3 questions that were very important. One from Chandra Jayavaratna, other one from Dinidu Jalvis, and the other one from Mudita Siraratyapa. One question was about whether we should have recall provisions. In principle, a little skeptical because it's very prone to abuse. But if we design it really very well with high thresholds that are required for the recall of MPs, I think it is something to seriously consider. That's the answer to that question. Second question was about whether, notwithstanding the MP having the confidence of Parliament, having to be appointed by the president, if the president still sort of stubbornly insists on appointing somebody else who he prefers, what do we do? 2 things. One is we need to clean up the wording of that current provision, which permits a subjective understanding that the president can sort of appoint, notwithstanding, he can decide who has the confidence of Parliament. That wording can be tightened up by removing the reference to the president's subjective opinion and making it much more clearer that the president has no choice in the appointment and the dismissal of the Prime Minister. It's only a formal thing that he does, but the substantive choice is made by Parliament on the basis of the confidence that it expresses or the confidence that it withdraws from the Prime Minister. That can be easily cleared up. We know what the loophole was when we learnt a lot from the 2018 constitutional crisis on that be closed easily. Chandra's point was about ministry secretaries, the appointment, which is an exemption to the general rule that the public service is the appointment, dismissal, disciplinary control. All of this is given to the Public Services Commission. But the ministry secretaries after 1972, this is something that we introduced into our system. The socialist government actually wanted political appointees because they wanted ideologically ministry secretaries to align with the ministers. So that was the provision there. It had never been changed. We can change that. Once again, we can have a process for ministry secretaries to be vetted, recommended by the Constitutional Council. Maybe a choice. Because it is also important, I think, that the ministry secretary be able to work with the minister, and it is not inappropriate for the minister to have some say, but we don't have to give it as a full discretion to the president and or the minister concerned or the prime minister. We can put in a process for that. That's again not a difficult design question.
Anyone else wants to add anything to what was said?
Well, there's a question about educational qualifications and MPs. I must say that I am not for educational qualifications for MPs. President Premadas have those qualifications because I feel that is classist and should not be there. What I feel is certain, and even criminal, is sometimes difficult because sometimes you're taken in as a political prisoner. Nehru, Gandhi, all these people had criminal records. So even if you say people with a criminal record can't be MPs, so maybe a criminal and a certain kind of crime, perhaps, that illicit, you can mention the kind of crimes that are covered that stop you from becoming a parliamentarian. But I think we have to be careful not to be elitist about who we let into parliament. It doesn't mean educated people are more democratic. In fact, a survey done by the International Center for Ethnic Studies found that actually the most intolerant people in the country are educated people. So I think we should be careful about that.
Yeah, I also would like to very much agree with Radhika on that point. Putting educational qualifications are thought of as some sort of solution to the issues that we have in terms of having very unqualified and patently sort of incompetent people in key positions. But remember that an education, even a PhD, and particularly Oxford DPhil, is no sort of guarantee of either competence or democratic behavior. So I think placing too much stock on that is a bit of a mistake. And the second point is, in our own experience, look, I mean, if we had the requirement of very high or even reasonably high educational qualifications, two of our most successful prime ministers, D.S. Seranayake and Mrs. Bandaranaike, would be out of the window, right? And those are sort of the kinds of things that we would end up with. I'm not in favor.
Yeah, I think there's another question which can be directed to Dr. Vijayawardena. There seems to be a lack of trust on state institutions, especially from the point of view of the diaspora, from what I see, and it's followed by, can the central bank build trust by having weekly press conferences about their decisions and processes followed?
Well, I think it's a must because the modern day central bankers are completely transparent people. Instead of hiding facts, they will have to actually reveal the facts to the people. And therefore, there must be a basic change in the communication policy of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. We have to be like the Bank of England or Bank of Canada, where even the minutes of the board meetings are being published for the information of the general public to know who is actually against for which and who has supported which kind of a policy, and it is not in secrecy at all. The present day Central Bank of Sri Lanka is like a black box. We know that the officers are going inside the bank building, and they are, at the end of the day, they come out, and we don't know what they are doing inside the bank building. So that is why it is necessary for the central bank to build confidence among the diaspora, so that whatever the demand which the central bank would make with respect to, say, the donations which Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe had asked at the present time, and also the investment in Sri Lanka, as Governor Lakshman had done immediately after he became the governor in year 2020. The Lakshman's program was a complete failure. We don't know enough information about the success or failure of Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe's donation campaign. But as the questioner had raised the issue, it is necessary that central bank should be a transparent institution. It should release more information to the public domain. It must be prepared to answer the questions that are being raised by the political circles, by media, by civil society organizations, rather than just misleading the members of the public. So it is a complete change in the communication policy of the central bank. And I hope that we actually, because present legislation, present Montreux Act does not prevent the central bank for going for this type of a communication policy. It can always do it. I hope Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe would take this factor into account and re-establish the credibility of the central bank, and before he would ask people to give donations to the foreign reserves of the country. It's a very much, very important topic, an important thing which we all must actually advocate for that.
Thank you. I think on that note, we do have a few other questions, but we have 2 more minutes to go, and some of the panelists, I understand, also have other commitments beginning exactly at 8 p.m. as well. So on that note, I think we will have to wrap up. So I'd just like to thank everyone who joined us on social media, but all of the panelists as well, for just immediately accepting our invitation. Just that we just made to most of you just 24 hours ago, or a little bit more than that. So thank you for accepting this invitation and being here. And thank you to everyone watching. But if you are not watching and protesting, then thank you to you as well for doing. There is some discussion on Twitter at the moment about kind of who is speaking for the protesters. I think no one can speak for the protesters because and there was a comment here as well that the protests have been intergenerational because there is a lot of framing that of young people, and that is true, but there are also people from across different generations in Goldface, but elsewhere protesting as well, and there is no one group that's speaking for them. It's across generations, ethnicities, religions, and so on, and that's also the beauty of this whole movement as well. So at the moment, on that note, I'd like to thank all of our speakers and all of you for joining, and let's keep this conversation and struggle going as well. Thank you. Good night.